you all can unmute yourselves when you want to ask a question or share in the conversation that will follow. But in the meanwhile, welcome back to our final session on grace-filled political conversations. We have been slowly moving our way through the book. Oops, sorry, I'm getting a phone call. Look at that. I think you're wrong. The book is called I Think You're Wrong, But I'm Listening. And we've been moving through the chapters of that book each week. And here today we are on our final chapter, and that is on exiting the echo chamber. And we've probably heard that term. And I'll let our presenter, Amy Graham, take it from here. Welcome, Amy. Thank you.
Yes, my pleasure. Thank you for asking me to participate. So this is the second to last chapter in our book, I Think You're Wrong, But I'm Listening. And so the focus for today will be covering this chapter, which is chapter 9, but also just taking a quick peek at the final chapter in the book, chapter 10, since we won't be meeting to discuss that. So one of the things that the author begins the chapter with is helping us to understand how siloed we all are and what an echo chamber we actually exist in many cases due to the results of social media. In fact, 2/3 of us get our news from social media, a full 66, I believe, or 65, nope, 67% in Americans that were surveyed in a Pew Research Center study found that these Americans were reliant on social media platforms for their news. And this is actually very problematic and actually contributes to the silos or echo chambers that we tend to live in. This is because of the algorithms that take place in all of social media, including Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, Instagram. All of these algorithms take in data based on what you click, what you like, and what you share. And then they serve up more content that aligns with your interests. I think we mentioned this earlier in our conversations in this book study, that if we were to take a moment and see the Facebook page of somebody very different than ourselves, we would be shocked to see what it looked like. Many of these news sources on social media platforms aren't exactly what we would consider vetted or reliable or peer-reviewed journalistic news sources. Unfortunately, there are many people who can write and submit to these social network platforms, and they look very much like what we would consider to be reliable sources. But unfortunately, based on what we click, based on what we like, based on all of the things, including our shopping experiences, our photos that we post, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter will continue to show us more of the same. So the system is built to please you, not to challenge you. And when something pleases you, you are far more likely to continue to go back to it again and again and again and again. It's very rewarding. Being challenged is usually not rewarding. And as Hunter mentioned last week in her summary of the chapter, it's actually very uncomfortable to be challenged. So in this chapter, the authors give us an exit the echo chamber challenge. What can we do to actually get out of this echo chamber and move on in a way that helps us to understand others who are not living in the same silo that we do? They propose 7 different tasks that you can do, and they propose that you do each task one day at a time. However, if your life is like mine, or if you like to be a little more intentional or thoughtful about each of these tasks, I would suggest you take some time to on each one rather than doing just one at a time or one day at a time. So I've actually outlined these tasks throughout an Advent calendar. getting us through each of these tasks through the end of the holiday season. And we're going to do a little bit of a deep dive into each of these tasks that they suggest that can help us get out of our echo chambers. The first one is the selfie challenge, or day one. And so I've got a selfie here of me at work. And what they suggest is that you take a selfie of yourself and share it with other people who might be going through the same challenge, meaning that are also participating in this challenge, and examine what is your why. Why do you want to exit the echo chamber? And I listed some of the reasons why people have chosen to really examine, why do things need to change? And these were items that were listed in the book: because no political party has a monopoly on good ideas, because writing off half the population is getting us nowhere, because I'm guilty of thinking I know it all and there is so much more to learn, because I believe empathy is the key to progress. These are just a few of the reasons that people listed for reasons that they may be excited to leave the echo chamber. And one of the quotes that I really liked in the book is, because confirmation bias is a threat to our democracy, or narcissism doesn't equal news, and arrogance doesn't equal analysis. These are all reasons that different people chose to leave the echo chamber. But I really want you to stop for a moment. And I'm actually, Chris, this is a little different than what we've done in the past. I want to have a conversation about why. Why have you come to this series? Why have you decided that this is important to you? Why do you keep showing up? Why do you want to have this conversation or possibly take this challenge? So Chris, if you might mute people for just a second, I'd love for us all to take a moment and think about our why, and perhaps some of you can share some of your whys.
Yeah, folks, you're free to unmute yourselves.
Thank you. One of my whys is after the 2016 election, my very best friend and I really were at odds with one another, and about these political differences that we had. And it's I'm a godparent to her children, and it has definitely impacted our relationship in a negative way. There were chunks of time throughout the last 4 years where we actually didn't talk to one another. And I miss her. I miss her terribly. And I love her. And I'm guilty of thinking that my way is the right way. And my why for continuing to put myself through this challenge and to engage with each of you is to help me formulate a different perspective on my friends' thoughts and feelings. I'd like to hear some of your whys.
Amy, this is Shirley. I guess what I noticed right away is that it went from small to large. Is there a reason for that? And does that mean something? You know, you started out with a small circle of because no political party, and then you went up.
No, I didn't weight each one differently, although I would say from a personal perspective, from my own thoughts, I do believe empathy is the key to progress. And that would be my biggest takeaway from this. But that's, okay. I think that's individual to me. It wasn't done intentionally though.
Okay, thanks.
I think I have to admit that I think I'm right, but I have some very good friends who are intelligent people who think very differently than I do. And we've stopped being able to have a decent conversation about politics. And I do believe that conversation and communication and being able to listen to different points of view without having that wall up before you hear anything is the key to the success of our democracy. So that's why I've joined.
Mhm. Alyssa shares in the chat that her why is understanding and open-mindedness to people is necessary for her to love people fully, because it pulls her out of her comfort zone and forces her to push herself.
Oh, I really like that to love people fully.
Yeah.
It's a hard thing to do.
That gets close to my why, which is, for me, it's a deep investigation into Jesus's call to love your neighbor. You know, it's easy to love the people that look like us and think like us and feel like us and speak like us and went to the same schools and blah, blah, blah. It is hard to love people who think way differently than you. That's probably that's where the rubber hits the road, frankly. That's my why, is I really want to try on as often as I can the challenge to love your neighbor.
Amy, I think for me, before this election, I had no problems discussing issues with people who had different opinions than I did. I always liked that, because sometimes I changed my mind. Sometimes it made me stronger in defending my own opinions. But I took this course because it's all changed since this past election. I'm having a much more difficult time talking to people who think differently, if they will talk to me. I find that a lot of times people don't want to talk about it. So these past 4 years have been different than my entire life. And that was really one of the reasons I took it.
I think that's a really excellent point. And if you look at what else is different with these last two elections that have been different from a news perspective or communication or broadcast communication perspective, the answer to that would be social media.
Yes.
And I'm hearing, not just from you, but from friends and neighbors and patients, the same comment, that this is somehow different. And we've managed in a lot of ways, or oftentimes, to put that blame on one party or the other, or one candidate or the other. But in some ways, I think it really is a perfect storm of a candidate or our current president who has a larger than life personality, that even without a cycle of news and misinformation that is bombarding us in our silos in social media, may be challenging for many people. And then when you combine that with misinformation and social media and news sources that are unreliable, it really is a perfect storm for really slamming that door and moving more into our own comfort zones rather than moving outside of our comfort zones. Does anybody else want to share what their why is?
Well, I think, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, you go ahead, please.
I think what I'm struggling with now is, I think I could go down that road with someone with talking about it, with the talks per se, than one who has actually done you wrong, action, you know. So there's a difference for me between the two, because you got talk, which I can forgive that, because the old saying, stick and stone may break your bones, but words will never harm you. But now when you actually have action to put in there of someone who has done you wrong, how do you deal with that?
Mm-hmm.
I think that old adage is not really correct, because I think words can often be more harmful than actions. They cause actions and reactions. They start wars.
They do.
And you're right, because the Bible say your tongue is a weapon.
Absolutely.
So this challenge, the first day or first step or first goal of this challenge is to identify your why. And thank you to so many of you for sharing. And I encourage everybody else to just take a step back and say, why am I doing this? Why is this important to me? Okay, so moving on then, the second suggestion for the challenge is to read 3 articles from different news sources than ones you would typically read. And when I read this, my first reaction was, oh my gosh, no way. There's no way I'm going to watch it. And I will, obviously tell you my bias. There's no way I'm going to watch Fox News. It sends my blood pressure off the charts. I immediately get angry. I have to do a deep breathing exercise, all of those things. And it's what the authors actually suggest, and rather than digging into CNN nonstop or watching Anderson Cooper, if that really offends you or really makes you angry, or sitting in for a Rush Limbaugh marathon, is to actually engage with a news source that isn't directly opposite your worldview approach. And not to really seek out sources that directly oppose your thinking, because this actually has the opposite effect. It hardens your perseverance. It makes you more likely to dig your heels in deeper. And from a psychology standpoint, I couldn't help but think about a therapy technique called motivational interviewing. And it's a technique that's empirically supported to help people with addiction problems, to help people change, basically, to think about the change in a way that it's generated from their own thoughts and feelings, and not because somebody else is telling them to change. And so as I looked and did a little research, it's pretty clear that our silos, our news sources, are very much siloed, just like our lives and perspectives tend to be. This is another Pew Research study that shows whether you lean Democrat or Republican, which news source you're more likely to watch. And we can see there a big difference between Fox News and CNN. But what the authors recommend is engaging in a news source that actually is through the lens of more of a liberal, conservative, or emotional analytical perspective. So if you are analytical and progressive, the suggestion is to try an analytical and conservative news source. If you are conservative and emotional, try a more emotional but also progressive source. So, it's important to list not the far ideological outreaches of our media environments, but rather sources that are mostly calm and intellectual. But this can be really hard. So, there are a lot of different charts like this available on the internet that diagram based on bias. And I liked this one. I felt that it took, well, first of all, it takes far more media sources into consideration. But so the idea would be that if you're such as myself, I skew liberal. And so a challenge for me would be to go to something that skews conservative, but is still reputable. So if I'm reading The Atlantic daily, I might want to choose to read an article, a political article from The Economist. And so I would really focus if you're taking this challenge, to choose something that is somewhere in this green circle. So The Atlantic, Slate, Vox, The Guardian, Wall Street Journal, Economist, Fiscal Times, or The Hill. And just kind of move to the other side of what you agree with typically. And so the authors recommend that you find 3 pieces, even small ones, that you can read. And then within each of those articles, find and look for 3 things that you can understand or even agree with. Don't just skim it and so to kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, because the over point may not be something you agree with, but look for 3 small points in the article that you can agree with. The third step in the Exit the Echo Chamber challenge, I think, is one of the most difficult.
Yeah.
And that is to have a conversation with someone who voted differently than you. And we've just came from Thanksgiving, or just experienced Thanksgiving. And although many people had a much smaller event than typical, holidays do tend to be a time where loved ones come together, and there you can be in the same room with someone who voted differently than yourself and feels very differently about political issues than you do. So this challenge encourages you to have a real life conversation, preferably face to face, although that's very difficult right now with COVID precautions. And they recommend that you don't have a stake intellectually, emotionally, or otherwise in the other person's thoughts and feelings. Approach the conversation with a you do you and I'll do me kind of mantra or perspective. And so really being intentional prior to starting the conversation and doing a self-check about your own emotional state of mind and how you're able to manage those emotions is important before you start that conversation. The second suggestion they have for these real life conversations is when you feel yourself reacting negatively, ask yourself, why am I reacting this way? And what could this conversation be like without my reaction? So I have found myself in family situations prior to COVID where I've had to exit the room or bite my tongue or bite my lip, or I've gotten so physically activated, physiologically activated because of anger. My heart is racing, my palms get sweaty, I can't think clearly, I can't remember the sources that I want to quote. And those are all stress responses to myself reacting negatively. And so I've had to excuse myself and ask myself, why am I reacting this way? And almost always the answer has been because I love the other person and I want them to agree with me. I want them to see how I see things because I love them and I care about them. And I want us all to be, in a way, in communion with one another. But that's not what diversity is. That's not how progress is made. That's not how we can all gain understanding and learn to celebrate the differences amongst each other. And so I've learned a lot of exercises, and I help some of my patients with this. When I feel those physiological responses, we know that activating our senses actually deactivates some of the portions of our brain that are over responding and giving us those physical responses to our anger or frustration or anxiety. And so doing something as simple as finding 5 things that I can see with my eyes, 4 things that I can hear with my ears, 3 things that I could touch, 2 things I could smell, or 1 thing that I could actually taste. This is called a grounding exercise, and it helps us relieve those physiological responses to uncomfortable stress or anxiety-provoking conversations. And it helps ground ourselves to keep those emotions at bay and keep our own reactions more manageable. When it gets difficult, when, let's say, now I've been able to manage my physiological responses, but I'm still really frustrated and I don't know where to go with this conversation. The author suggests that you kind of channel your inner talk show host and conduct a kind and respectful interview. So imagine, if you will, during these heated moments that you're being videotaped and others are going to see this interview. What might they want to know? How do you want to present yourself? And so here are some helpful questions that you can ask. When did you start to think about, and then whatever this issue is. So when did you start to think about abortion this way? Was there ever a time that you thought differently about it? What changed your thoughts about that, if the time you thought differently? Have you had a personal experience or a loved one related to this issue? Have you always voted for this party? I had a colleague that was very surprised to find that throughout my lifetime of voting in presidential elections, I haven't always voted for the same party. And I think that opened a door for a great conversation between the two of us. And they were very surprised to learn that about me. When you think about future elections, what's really important to you? That helps us all really capture the big issues, the big things that are most salient and that we most identify with our values. What do you think the biggest challenge for the next 4 years would be? These are all questions that don't tend to trigger such strong emotional responses, but also help lead into continued conversation. So before I move on to the next challenge, one more piece of the real life conversation, sorry about that. Don't make assumptions and recognize when the other person is making assumptions. And I chose a photo of the mask here. This is an issue, that many people make assumptions. If they see someone without a mask, they might think, oh, there's a Republican. And that's definitely not the case. These are assumptions that people make. A great a way to address this is I understand why you think I'd support mask wearing, since many people in my party do. Oops, sorry for the typo there. But my perspective is different. To me, it's not political. To me, it's about my partner who has severe asthma, or I'm going to start chemo treatments in a week. And to me, it's really important not to get sick. Or to me, it's really important to see my grandmother for Christmas. And so I'm doing all that I can to make sure I stay healthy. So understanding what someone else's reason for doing something really only happens by conversation. We can't make assumptions. And then keep it calm. Hey, I'm trying to learn from our conversation, not debate. Do you mind if I take some notes while we talk? And these were suggestions from the author about how to keep things calm. And I was a little taken back with the, do you mind if I take some notes while we talk? But the point that they were trying to make is when you start to do that, and the person that you're talking with is very, very angry or frustrated, they tend to get back on their best behavior if they think you're really engaged and interested. And that's civil, it brings a sense of civility back. But if you notice that someone has a really bad reaction, and as a psychologist, I can't take notes while anybody talks because everybody makes an assumption that I'm psychoanalyzing or doing something that psychologists don't actually do at all. But this may work for you and it may not. It was just a suggestion about these real life conversations. But in listening to everybody in the last few weeks, it seems as though, and also hearing your reasons today, this is one of the biggest challenges, is to have these real life conversations in a meaningful and respectful way. So I'd like to hear some of your thoughts about this before I move on to the next point in the overall challenge. Has this been hard for people? Is this where people draw the line? Like I'm good with this challenge so far, but I'll be damned if I'm gonna go next door to my neighbor and who has that huge Trump sign and actually try to talk politics. It's pointless. What are your thoughts about this?
I think it's,
Well, that's kind of my thought. My neighbor is a trumpet, so I'm not going next door and have a conversation with her.
And I'm living with two trumpets. It's very challenging, and what you just said is so helpful.
Well, let's remind ourselves too, for the Trump voters on the call,
Yes.
it's not about Trump, it's about, or Republicans, it's about people who are different than us. And so it's both ways. But I saw you unmuting yourself.
Oh.
Bud, you need to unmute yourself.
Oh.
I think one of the most important things you said is that the conversations you're talking about, most of what I hear you saying is by asking questions, not yourself talking, but listening to the other person to try to find out what their experiences have been in life, why they think the way they do. We can have better understanding of other people and empathy with other people if we know more about them as people and more about their experiences and why they are thinking the way they think.
I agree. Why do you think that's so hard for people to do, though? And I say that to everyone, not you specifically.
It's hard for me to,
Go ahead.
it's hard for me to do, to either approach friends that I have who are very, very liberal, whose opinions feel threatening to me, and people who are dear to me who are very far right, whose opinions feel threatening. So I'm really appreciating this conversation to go to approach people with gentle questions and a real genuine curiosity to find out why they have the opinions that they do, what those opinions are and why they have them. So thank you for all this.
Yeah, and I really like what you said there about curiosity and approaching people with questions and with an openness to learn and listen. These are not easy things to do, especially if the topic is something that you feel very passionately or strongly about. But you know, as the gentleman who spoke first mentioned, you know, asking questions and making it more about the other person and not yourself is a great entryway into understanding someone else's perspective.
I want to just chime in there on that point, Amy. I really want to underline that perspective of imagining yourself as the interviewer. I think that is, if you had to boil this down to a certain technique, that is probably the one I would underline the most highly, because it changes the tenor of the conversation, because these things so quickly fall into a debate. That's what they do on the news. It's all about a debate format. And so the interview makes it about them, and it invites the listener in to A, listen, B, to learn more about this person that you theoretically are called to love, right? Or maybe you really do love them. Maybe you're not just theoretically called to love them, but here's an opportunity to interview them and get to know them. What makes them tick? What's behind what is it about their values that causes them to have these opinions? I want to know more. And you have to just almost surrender to yours. And here's I think one of the challenges when I do this, by the way, is folks aren't necessarily going to be self-revealing. They often start off with just sort of barking platitudes at you. And you may ask them, okay, tell me more about how did you come to that opinion? Or did you always feel that way? It actually is hard to get them. But if you hang in there, people will actually start to share. And once they do that about themselves, it does change the tenor. And then the other thing I would say is it's quite easy for it to begin to fall back into debate. You can get triggered, you can get defensive as the listener. And I've noticed in those moments, it's so helpful to use one of the techniques to kind of step back. One of my favorite techniques is to do an act of hospitality. Can I get you something to drink? You know, just to reimagine our humanity of two people here having a conversation. Can I get you something to eat? I'm going to go grab a breakfast roll. Can I get you something? And that kind of just is a good chance to pause and catch yourself if you're noticing it getting back into a debate format. And then the third thing I'm going to say about this is it's really hard to be the interviewer listening to them because they don't always reciprocate. They may not ever ask you about your opinions or your values or where you came to them from or your life or your history. They may not go there, and it can feel very one-sided. And I'm going to suggest that is a moment, that is an invitation to really model Jesus, you know, and to just be present to them for this moment and resist don't get resentful when they don't reciprocate.
I'm trying to stay quiet because of my fear of the re-education camps and the guillotine. In a previous life, I had the responsibility for acquiring property to build roads. And that we sent negotiators out to talk to people who didn't want to sell their property, to try to reach an agreement with them, which means I had to listen a lot to find out what their concerns were. And I had one of the gals who was doing this for me was a pregnant lady. It's really hard to say no to a pregnant lady. But we had to do a lot of listening and find out what their concerns were. So I have a negotiation history, which means that I need to listen a lot to people and hear what they have to say and see if we can reach an agreement on something.
Mhm.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think that means that, or might mean that you have excellent skills in this area that could be helpful to the rest of us. You mentioned negotiate, and that can be problematic sometimes as we're both trying to convince the other person to kind of lean in a way that's acceptable to ourselves, right? A successful negotiation really means that both parties walk away fairly happy. And unfortunately, in political conversations, that doesn't happen very often. Whereas when you approach it with this perspective of interviewing and asking questions and curiosity, there's no leaning one way or another. It's just an openness to hear everything that the person has to say. And it's definitely really, really difficult. And I think
So you have to find the common goal and which
right.
values you share.
Yeah, those are great suggestions. So moving forward to the next step in the challenge is to send a letter or email to someone you've disagreed with politically. And I'm in the process of doing this right now with my friend, who we disagree on a few major issues that I think have really impacted our friendship. And the author suggests that you send an email really trying to explain your perspective. And they give a wonderful example of a woman talking about her writing a letter to her mother about late term abortion and why the daughter is frustrated with one political party's perspective on this first that her mother takes, and why this means something to her, why this is important to her. And so this is that opportunity to be able to express what you're thinking, what you're feeling, and without the feedback, without the bounce and forth back of a conversation that could turn into an argument. And it also allows you to be more intentional, to choose your words carefully. You could reread it, you could edit it, you can make changes to it, you can learn something about yourself just in the process of writing it. So this is an interesting challenge, and one that for those who really don't want that face-to-face interaction or aren't really ready for that, or feel that you've tried that and this just isn't working, this is another suggestion. The next thing I think is easy for some and very difficult for others, and that is to compliment the other side. And so I've listed some suggestions for compliments that the authors gave that I like. You've thought a lot about this. This is really important to you. You're such a kind person. You've done a lot of research on this. It's obvious how much you care. I really love talking with you because you're so insightful. These are not things I would typically think of in the heat of an argument with a sister at the Thanksgiving dinner table, right? It takes an intentionality. It takes a moment to actually think about what compliment you can give. Now, I don't suggest that we aren't true to ourselves, right? To just throw out these compliments if you don't really mean them. although the fake it till you make it thing actually works for some. And especially it can help diffuse an argument, much like Father Chris said, I take this opportunity to provide some sort of service or hospitality, that works. You're showing an act of kindness. You're also giving yourself a moment to excuse yourself, catch your breath, kind of do maybe a grounding exercise and return in a better place of mind. But I think the challenge here is finding a true compliment, something that you really do believe is a good quality in the other person. And these compliments can diffuse things so quickly. I see Chris nodding. Do you have anything you want to add to that, Chris?
Oh, I mean, I'm a supporter of the fake it till you make it category. And
Yeah.
I think you're quite right. We ought to challenge ourselves. Find something, I was chatting with somebody last night who was telling me, you really need to check out these really extreme corners of the internet to get out of your echo chamber, Chris, and my compliment I was coming to me was saying, man, you're really passionate about this. You are really spending a lot of time reading up on this. I really am amazed by that. That was an honest compliment in that moment, Anyway, yeah, amen.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. So the last two tasks I've actually put on a timeline happening concurrently at the same time as all the other tasks instead of waiting to do these at the end. And the first one is to draw an empathy map, which I really, really, really like this exercise. And so I want to start by just defining empathy, because empathy and compassion are two different things. Empathy means you can both intellectually understand someone else's feelings and vicariously experience those feelings, even for just a moment. And so what is an empathy map? Well, the authors give us a suggestion, an outline for one, and it starts with thinking and feeling. So really trying to put yourself in the other person's perspective and ask yourself, what are they thinking and feeling? What really matters to them? What are their major preoccupations? What are the things that they get hung up on? They stick on it all the time. And those are things, that's a signal that that's something that's really important to the other person. What are they worried about? What are their aspirations? What do they hope happens in the near future? And as these lines are coming down, this person in the center, this image represents this person who's very different from you, that has a different political perspective. And what we're doing here is putting together a way to help ourselves empathize with them. The second thing is to imagine and try to understand, what are they seeing? What environment are they living in? Who are their friends? What perhaps is their social media offering to them? The next one is say or do. What are their attitudes in public? Is keeping a certain appearance important to them? What are their behaviors towards others? Perhaps this appearance is very important for family or business connections, but we might see that their actions or their behaviors are very, very different than that. Why might that be? That also helps us understand their perspective. What are they gaining from this perspective? What do they need? What do they want? Are they somehow measuring their success based on this influence? Are there obstacles based on the opposing viewpoint that is preventing them from gain? A great example of this might be the local small businesses who want the bars or restaurants open or the stores open, and they're losing their businesses. A very true, honest concern. At the same time, how do we balance that with the concern of the rapid spread of COVID in our area? What pain are they feeling? What are they afraid of? What are they frustrated with in their life? What obstacles are they facing every day that perhaps we don't really think about? And last, what are they hearing? What are their friends saying? What are their boss saying? What are their other major influences in their lives saying? And I think this is so well illustrated when we just look at red states, red counties, blue counties. We are influenced by the people around us because we hear these other things, these things that the people that we associate with say. And these people might be people we love and we value. And so we move along with their perspective rather than thinking independently. And so if you have somebody in your life that this is, someone you really want to continue this relationship with in a loving way, but you just cannot understand their political perspective, or it just makes you furious or angry, or it just makes you want to be nowhere near them, drawing an empathy map or identifying some of these things for the other person can really help us understand their perspective and see things a bit differently. Has anybody had an experience where, I know Chris has shared one in a prior week, but does anybody have an experience where they've been able to look at one of these particular areas and gain a different perspective on the person?
I was going to say, Amy, as people try this exercise or think about how they might try it on, what do you say, Amy, about, is there an invitation here to really use a kind of holy imagination? We may not know the answers to all of these about somebody, right?
Yeah, I think that would be very helpful. It also, as you do this, it helps you identify, wow, I don't know this. Maybe I should ask them. Mm-hmm. I don't know this part of their life. I don't know really how they've been during COVID. We often just say, oh, fine, and that's it. Because no one dives in to really understand what's going on in other people's lives. And so, yep, I think you can try to fill in the blanks. And I think that's very helpful, especially with people who perhaps aren't close to you, or strangers, or people that you see on television and you just can't imagine why they're doing what they're doing, or why they're saying what they're saying. You might have to fill in some of those blanks. But I would encourage, if it's someone you know, to actually have the conversation.
I have one related to the here part of this map. But first, I really want to thank you, Amy. This is an amazing, amazing talk and so practical. And I want to sign up for any course you care to teach. So I've been really thinking throughout the whole conversation about this one experience I have that I actually mentioned to you all last week. If you heard last week's, you might remember me telling you about a sudden moment I had where I wanted to spit on my neighbor's sign. And I was so taken aback by my reaction. So I was thinking a lot about loving one's neighbor. This is a neighbor whose name I don't know, that I pass their house all the time, but I know their political views pretty loud and clear. And I was walking there yesterday with my husband, and I said to him, I've been reading this book at this forum at church, and it's caused me to really look at this neighbor differently. And, I don't want to be coy with our group here. The sign they have is for Trump, and that's not my leaning. And so I say that because it's kind of important to my observation around this empathy map. I said, I'm really trying to replace my thinking in reaction to this with something that comes from love and curiosity. And my husband was like, are you kidding me? And he began to list all kinds of offenses that people who are not for Trump would associate with Trump and a Trump administration. And they were really, really persuasive. And I kind of stopped. I'm like, gee, you're right. It's really hard for me to feel like somebody who would espouse any of that behavior I can understand or empathize with or love. And I felt really stuck in that. And as I've been listening today and thinking about one of your earlier questions of what keeps us from the step around conversation, I was thinking it's because I feel like at the end of the day, our values must be so violently dissimilar. And yet, as I put it in the context of this whole echo chamber conversation, I think, wait a minute, no, I don't think it's about values. I think it's about what are our influences? What is our echo chamber? And they must live in a very different part of that fabulous slide you've got where you map all the news sources, that one. They must spend a lot of time in a really different place than I do there. Their influences must tell them, let's just take one particular trope that people could get heated about, and that is the idea of children in cages, right? I don't believe that my neighbor has a value that says children have no value and should be put in cages. I believe that they have influences that tells them a really different story about what happened, who had ownership of that policy, what is true and what is not. And so their influences must take them to a really different conclusion than mine do. And so when I look at it that way, it takes me away from this fear that I can't talk with them because our values around kids in cages are so different, right? Where do you go with that? You can't convince somebody. But it's a lot more helpful if I realize that I think they love their kids and I think they love other kids. And so all I can come to is maybe this, I think you're wrong, but I'm listening, isn't where I need to go with that neighbor. First, I probably need to learn their name. And then second, maybe I need to find something that we have in common that we have a beach lot. Maybe we clean up our beach lot and I would like them in the way that they do that. And we just stay away from the politics because we dwell in different influence sources. And I need to be really careful, and this is the thing I most wanted to talk about today, to ask if anyone else experiences this. I need to be really careful to avoid virtuous condescension that would say, I love you, neighbor, because I'm a good Christian, and you're totally wrong, and your sign is offensive, and I'm right about everything I view politically, but I'm going to love you anyway, because that's what I'm trying to be a good Christian. And I think that's virtuous condescension.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Hunter. And I think, what came to my mind as you were talking is when I think about Jesus and I think about how he was able to really empathize with Mary Magdalene, with Zacchaeus, and that Zacchaeus is mentioned in the book actually, with people who were not necessarily influential, who were oftentimes considered on the wrong side of things. And it wasn't from a place of that indignation or from a place of condensation. It was from a place of love and seeing and understanding what that other person felt. And while I don't have those capabilities fully as Jesus, obviously none of us do, I think taking a look at this empathy map can help us really come from the same place that Jesus wants us to come from. And that is putting all these differences aside and trying to understand this other human's condition.
Thank you. It's really, really thought-provoking, all of it.
Yeah. All right. So moving on in this, and as I mentioned earlier, I have the Draw the Empathy Map challenge kind of running through all of the dates because it's something you could do at any time. And I actually think it helps for each of the other tasks to prepare you and helps you come at it from a more intentional, heartfelt way. The last item on the challenge is to take action. And how do we do that? What do the authors suggest that we do? Well, the first thing they suggest is to close your computer and put down your phone. Now, recall this book was written prior to COVID. And in a lot of ways, our computer and phone is the only way that we can connect with other people. And that I understand. And I think when I say close your computer, put down your phone, I mean more from a perspective of, what I call doom scrolling on Twitter, using it to just fill your time for an entertainment purpose of reading and learning things that maybe other people are saying. Because remember, we're not actually reading and learning what other people are saying. We're reading and learning what an algorithm is choosing to show us, right? There's a big difference there. The second suggestion for taking action is to decide what action fits best with your values, your time, and your talents. And I chose this photo because you might be a person who feels very strongly about climate change and the environment, but you may not feel comfortable writing letters, going to your congressman, giving speeches, and advocating in a way that requires you to be very, let's say, verbal or very in a public view. But doing something like continuing or helping to plant and working at best you can to recycle and do things at your own level that meet that value for you, that's taking action as well. And the last suggestion is to actually schedule it. Oftentimes we say we want to do things like, oh, I want to write a letter to my governor, or I want to go to that march downtown, but we don't actually schedule it. We don't actually write it on our calendars and intentionally make time to do it. And so one of their suggestions is to actually schedule the activity. And again, this can be done at any time during this challenge. So I did want to just briefly touch on before we open for conversation. I know we're out of time and others have to leave. In the final chapter of the book, they talk about keeping conversations nuanced. And I really like that. And we tend to think of keeping conversations nuanced as being open-minded, being open to different shades of gray, moving past typical political talking points. But as the authors point out, and as we've kind of moved as a community in our understanding of each other, I think, and they also state that we need to treat nuance as a verb. It is a practice, a lifelong practice, much like exercising, learning how to knit, playing the piano. Engaging in nuanced discussion requires constant conditioning and attention to the fundamentals. So I think chapter 9 and what I've just covered does a great job at laying out those fundamentals and different ways you can approach it. But I think we need to remember that this is a practice. It's not easy. It doesn't come easily for most of us. It takes time and it takes continued practice. And that is something, if that is your only take action point, that you continue to practice and continue to work on it, I think that would be a good thing. So that is all that I have for today. Let me stop sharing my screen if I can. Let's see here.
I'm going to thank you, Amy. Can we all just take a moment and thank Amy for her amazing presentation? That was wonderful, Amy. Really well thought out. I'm glad you were here with us, especially on that empathy map. I knew that was going to be up your alley, as I recall now. Now I remember why you got this one. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Amy.
Yes,
I'm gonna
thank you.
I'll bring this to an official close, friends, and just because we're at the end of the hour, but you are all invited to hang around for a little afterglow conversation to continue this dialogue. Ask Amy more questions and share your own reflections. This is our final session together, and I love to hear what people are taking away from it. What are we willing to try on out of all those practices? Where are we going to start? Thank you again. It's been such a blessing to have this time with you all. We'll see you at our next forum. Bye-bye.